Hi, class. I'm Ernest Johnson, also known as Dr. J, and today's lecture is on slavery in the U.S. economy. I'd like to start by framing our conversation in the words of Edward Baptiste, renowned Southern historian at Cornell University, who wrote a seminal book on this topic called "The Half Has Never Been Told: The Making of American Capitalism." In his work, he asks a couple of questions. One is, how does a fledgling young country, barely being able to produce and export tobacco from its East Coast, in a couple of generations, dominate the world market in the production of cotton? How does this young former colony of England, a fledgling new nation, move from producing 1.4 million pounds of cotton in 1790 to 2 billion pounds, with a B, billion pounds of cotton in 1860? And in order to answer that question, we don't have to think much farther than the title of this lecture: Slavery and the U.S. Economy. We know that the slave trade was complex, but to get an overview of it, it's often good to think of it as triangular. And we can actually think of it as multiple triangles, but the basic trade, triangular trade, was merchants coming from Europe, the majority of them from England over time, bringing goods and trading them along the slave coast of West Africa, what they called the slave coast of West Africa, where they were looking for enslaved Africans, taking those enslaved Africans across the ocean to the New World in chains, and then selling them for products which they would then return to the European market. That was the basic triangle. Now, there were other triangles that existed, but that's what the triangle that fueled the transatlantic slave trade. The core commodity of this trade were the Africans that were collected, bought, sold, enslaved on the west coast of Africa primarily, though many of them were brought from the interior of Africa, and then shipped to the Americas and the Caribbean. Most of those enslaved persons were carried on ships that were built in Europe, and the primary enslaver over time, as I said, was England. If we take one particular city in England, Liverpool, we see that Liverpool dominated the slave trade, and that the benefit of that domination was evident in their society, from the mayor on down to the beggar in the street, the artisans in their shops, the textile workers in their mills, the ship builders, the insurance companies, the bankers, and the other financiers were in Liverpool and its surrounds were living off of the blood, sweat, and tears of Africans who were generating the wealth for this society. We know that in 1 year of the 18th century, 1780, Liverpool, ships built in Liverpool carried 300,000 Africans to the New World in the 1780s, not in 1 year, but in the 1780s, over 1 decade, 300,000 Africans were carried to the New World in ships built in Liverpool. And annually, they were making over 300 pounds a year just generated off of the slave trade. 60% of the slave trade in England came out of Liverpool, which represented 40% of the slave trading in all of Europe. On these ships, and goods were being exchanged in that triangle that we talked about, which generated an economy in England and helped to build England into the power that it once became. The power that was built by its artisans, its leather workers, that the wealth that was gained that benefited its shoemakers, those that produced the vats and the barrels for the rum that was being produced from the sugar that was being grown in the Caribbean and in the Americas. So you had coppers and tanners and sailmakers and bankers and insurers and the society as a whole benefiting from this very lucrative slave trade. Millions of gallons of New England rum were then taken to Africa to purchase additional slaves. In fact, a person living in Liverpool in the 18th century, if they had a stake, this could be an average sailor, if he had enough money, a stake that he could take, he or she, but he typically could take and purchase Africans in Africa and then survive the voyage to the New World and back to England and sell those products in England and repeat this by purchasing more Africans back to the Americas and back to England, that person would be wealthy at the end of their second voyage. This is just a sailor because of how lucrative this trade was. So if a person started out with a collection of money, they could actually become wealthy in 2 triangular circuits. We see on the ships that here an advertisement is being made for 250 fine, healthy Negroes. And it goes on to say that they have just arrived from the windward rice coast. So they've come from the rice growing area of West Africa. And in many cases, the rice farmers in the Caribbean and in the Americas, this happens to be going to Charleston, but in the rice growers in the Caribbean and the Americas would actually contract for Africans from certain regions like Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea, where they grew rice. And then they would bring them to areas where they were growing rice in the so-called New World because they were already acclimated to the rice growing. And here they're talking about the fact that these Africans who had been housed in pens, in conditions that we've already talked about, in these dungeons in West Africa, had concocted smallpox and had survived it, And so they already had some immunity to smallpox. And this was also being touted as one of their benefits. So these enslaved people were coming in at an accelerated rate, and they were being distributed throughout the colonies established by Europeans in the New World. The majority of them came to Brazil because it was the closest journey from West Africa, over a third, and then sort of equally distributed between the Caribbean and Mexico and Spanish America. Only about 6% came to what we now call the United States, and another 6% to the Danish and Dutch and Swedish holdings in the Caribbean. But as we said, this trade was dominated by the British, and the vast majority went to Brazil. And of the entire trade, just a little less than 6% actually were imported into what we now call the United States. Over time, we can see that there were certain periods where the slave trade was just starting off with the Portuguese going into Africa and enslaving Africans, many of them taken back to Europe before the colonies were established in the New World. And then as those colonies were established, you had an importation into the New World. You had the greatest acceleration of importation, which means the greatest disruption on the African continent, and the most heinous conditions experienced by Africans in any particular centennial period was between 1701 and 1810. And we'll come back and talk about this period and its significance in particular to what is now the United States. And then you still had, even after the slave trade is abolished in 1807 by the English, in 1808 by the Americans, not abolishing slavery, but abolishing the slave trade, you still have significant, almost 2 million people still being bought and sold in what was now called the New World. The initial crop in the Caribbean was sugar. It was the cash crop that was generating the most investment, and it was the crop in which most enslaved Africans were working. And that is true throughout the 18th century, right into the early 19th century. In the early 19th century, you have the advent of another crop, which is cotton. And we have cotton starting to be grown now in the newly acquired land within the United States. So in 1803, those original 13 colonies and those that they had acquired just to the west doubled its size by the acquisition of what they call the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, where we purchased a segment in the middle of the US around the Mississippi River and extending westward and eastward. We purchased this from the French for about $15 million because Napoleon had lost his foothold in Haiti and could no longer, his dream of actually forcing the British out of North America, he realized would not come to fruition. And so he sold his stake along the Mississippi River and all the territory that they had purchased from Spain. And of course, this was indigenous territory that and indigenous people were never properly compensated for. But this new territory now provided land for entrepreneurs to invest capital in order to make a profit. And the most profitable crop at this time was cotton. And so you had the slaveholders in the South along the East Coast now migrating westward into this new territory and taking slavery with them. So, and this led to conflict with Mexico. It led to the acquisition of Texas. It leads to the Mexican-American War. It leads to the United States ending up taking half of Mexico. But back to our story about the enslavement of Africans, now we have an advent where there's an opportunity to grow what they call short staple cotton to the West, and there's a need for labor. Unfortunately for the slave owners and shippers, the slave trade had been abolished in 1808. And so there was a need to work around this problem because the profits were so immense at this time. So we moved from these sporadic rice crops and tobacco crops along the East Coast to now establishing, acquiring, and cultivating large tracts of land in order to grow another cash crop, which was the short fiber cotton. And this was accelerated by the advent of the cotton gin, which was invented in 1793 by Eli Whitney, allegedly. And that allowed the harvesting and separation of the fiber from the husk of the cotton in a very efficient manner, which allowed for greater cultivation of this variety of cotton. And so you have this westward expansion of cotton, and then you have a westward expansion of slavery, because the new land that was acquired, which was indigenous land, right, is now going to be worked to grow a cash crop by enslaved Africans who are now being forced into this area. They're being transported by land, forced marched by land, and also transported by sea around in the port of New Orleans. So they're coming in both ways. Most of them now, since the abolition of the slave trade, are coming from what they call the upper South. So above South Carolina into Virginia and Maryland and over into Tennessee, and a few places in the lower South, such as South Carolina and Louisiana, are also providing African people, breaking up families and so forth in order to feed the trade. So the cotton gin really led to not only the increase in the ability to produce cotton and the ability now for this nation to begin to move towards dominating the world market by 1860. 60% of the world market in cotton is dominated by the United States, but the source of that labor was enslaved African labor, and the ability in order to be so productive necessitated a degree of harshness that is difficult for us to really comprehend unless we dig into it a little bit. I want to talk about that. The nature of the slave system that developed after the abolition of the slave trade, right, is distinctly different than the slave system that existed prior to it. And the main difference was the cotton crop, the tremendous profit that could be made in growing cotton, and the labor-intensive nature of cotton growing, which meant that there was always a need for more labor. And so the practices of extracting labor became unrestrained because the profits now were unlimited. When I say unlimited, I mean that people generally could get a 10% return on their investment guaranteed in trading Africans themselves. And if you're talking about investing in cotton, your profit margin accelerated. And 10% was what was guaranteed. People were making 20% on their investment. In some cases, 13% average on your investment. So what happens after 1808 when the United States abolishes the slave trade is we start a domestic slave trade, meaning that we're now shipping slaves from the upper South into the lower South. The issue was here that families that used to have some degree of cohesion were now being torn apart. Fathers, sons, mothers, daughters, aunts, grandmothers were being shipped away, right? In order to feed the demand of the beast of cotton production in the South. And so some of the pretenses and the niceties of slavery that were developed and cultivated prior to the domestic slave trade were thrown aside, and the gloves were taken off, and families were disrupted as a matter of business, as a matter of course. Excuse me. And again, you had the trade by sea and you had the trade over land. Also, in order to be successful in breaking up families, there had to be harsher treatment and harsher control. In order to force march people over land, you had to intimidate them and terrify them and set examples and make examples of them. In order to take someone's child from them or someone's wife from them and their husband and sell them into slavery, you had to increase your degree of harshness, because the very practice of breaking up families and so forth and shipping off a person's parents or children, right, was already harsh, but it was even made harsher because there was, of course, resistance to this on the part of the enslaved Africans. And so you can see how this population of enslaved folks is increasing rapidly. And when you look at 1810 with the advent of the domestic slave trade, you see that still there now is an increase in the number of slaves in the US, and this is driven by cotton. One of the ports in the 18th century, the primary port in the 18th century, was Charleston Harbor. Sullivan Island was where the actual port existed, and this plaque is from there. My wife and I and daughter visited there a few years back. We went to the Slave Museum, we visited Sullivan's Island, and this plaque really talks about and is a memorial to what they call, you know, this hideous trade, this business of breaking up families and buying and selling human beings. And it is a recognition of the contributions of Africans in various different fields. And this is during and after slavery up into the present, which they have not been given credit for. And so it talks about contributions in the arts and in medicine and in science and in politics and in religion, law, aesthetics, anywhere they're given the opportunity, they have contributed. And it talks about really this, the injustice of slave trade and how this was turned around. But here is an interesting piece that came out of the Slave Museum in Charleston, which I recommend if you get a chance to visit it, because it is an attempt at righting some wrongs and telling a history that is often left untold. But this is one slave trader's schedule of evaluating the wealth of human beings for sale. And so it goes from extra men right down to what he calls fancies and scrubs. And then they're priced out. The extra men in 1860 were selling for $1,500 to $1,600 per person. the number one men, the next quality after that, for 14 to 1500. The second rate, just an ordinary male, was selling for over $1,000, up to $1,250 per head. And in order to understand what that was worth, the equivalent of it in 2007 is given here. You're talking about between $36,000 and $38,000 for the extra men, and $26,000 and $30,000, and so forth. And so the amount of money that a person needed, right, to purchase slaves was insurmountable for most people. And that's why large plantations, which providing the labor on these cash crops, were owned by a very small percentage of people, less than 1% in the South, the plantations over 100. And the amount of wealth that can be generated needs to be appreciated, not just in terms of what the slaves produced, but they themselves were valuable. They themselves were collateral. So you could borrow to purchase additional land based upon the value of the slaves that you held as property, the human beings that you held as property. You also could train them in skills. And so you would have, like in the case of Harriet Jacobs' father, a person who was trained in skills like carpentry. And then they go out and work, and the majority of their profit goes to their slave master. So you could make money in that way. And then and on, you would have people whose business it is, right, to barter, to buy and sell slaves on the open market. You would have you will have entire police forces that were developed around slave patrolling, making sure that slaves were staying on the plantation and not running away. You had so many industries that were benefiting from slavery, but the average worker was not. If you look at like the class structure of Southern society, we see that basically only about 25% of the society were slave owners. And the majority of that 25% owned less than 9 slaves. And the majority of them owned less than 6 slaves, 5 or less. So the vast majority of that 25% owned less than 9 slaves, and a significant number less than 6 slaves. Those that owned between 10 and 99 slaves, about less than 7%. And again, those that owned 100 or more, 0.1% were the elite slave holders of the time with these very large plantations. So the average person in the South was, if they were a farmer, competing against slave labor. How can you yourself, right, take a crop to market when slaves are growing it even on the side for free? And of course, when you have slave labor, you can have very depressed wages for other workers in the society. And so one of the things that slavery did is that it led to an economic underdevelopment of the South as a whole. And it led for the need to get the majority of Southerners to buy into a system that they weren't directly benefiting from, except for in the sense that they were taught that they were superior to slaves. And so no matter how bad their condition was, they could always find people who were doing worse, who were Black people. And in that sense, there was an investment in slavery on the part of what I would call the majority of Southern society. But those that were really benefiting from it, that's just this slice right here. So there were various crops that were being grown, and cotton was the critical crop, and the United States dominates the market, up to 2 billion pounds of it being produced per day by 1860. And the motivation for growing that crop was that it was a good investment on your money, The average rates of return during this period of time was between 2 and 5.4%. But when you looked at the South, and particularly in the Atlantic area, people who made investments in growing cotton and made investments in buying and selling slaves. So primarily cotton, some other crops, but buying and selling slaves, they would be getting this high return on their investment. And when you see that type of high return, that sure thing that you're going to make at least 10% and so forth, you find people throwing a lot of money in that direction. That's how slavery was not just a Southern phenomenon. Slavery was an American tradition that was the bedrock of the democracy that was built. Another way of saying that is that the American democracy was built upon a slaveocracy. And the people who invested in it were people at all sectors of commerce: bankers, insurance companies, shippers, builders, manufacturers, railroad titans, etc., were investing in this system. But cotton was the dominant crop by far, and it was a cash crop that was labor intensive and led to all of the negative side effects that we talked about. Simultaneous with this going on, you had Africans both running away and free Black in the society. Crispus Attucks is interesting in that he was a runaway from slavery in the North. Boston, Massachusetts was the first state, the first colony of the 13 colonies to legalize slavery. Slavery was not a phenomenon just of the South. He ran away from his master. He was a biracial person. They called him a mulatto. We don't want to use that word because it comes from Portuguese mule, and it's mule. But he was a mixed race person or a biracial person who was of Wampanoag, most likely, and African descent. He ran away, he worked in the docks, and he's probably born sometime around 1723. And he stood up to the British in Boston, leading to the Boston Massacre, where 4 Americans were killed, which was the first act of defiance and the first bloodshed in the American Revolution. And the first person to die was this Black person, or this biracial person, Crispus Attucks. Of course, he's Black by the rule of hypodescent because he has some African blood, but he's also biracial by the fact that his mother was Wampanoag. Okay. So you have this dilemma where you have Africans who are patriotic to their country. Imagine a person who is indigenous, whose mother is indigenous, what this country means to them, no matter who claims it, right? It's still yours, right? And then you have them standing up to the British, who are colonizing the inhabitants of the 13 colonies, but those inhabitants themselves are treating people of African descent as second-class citizens. And so that's that double consciousness or dilemma that is always present in the minds and bodies of people of color who resist oppression. This carries on by Africans joining the fray, African Americans fighting to free this country from the British. This picture shows Peter Salem hiding behind his master, but we know that in fact he stepped up and he was rewarded for his bravery, and that he actually killed a British major who was cited for his bravery. Prince Hall also was a freedman who worked for the emancipation of slaves and encouraged them to fight for the revolutionary cause. He went on to found the Black Freemasons, which still exist today, the Black Masons, founded by Prince Hall, who himself came to the US from Barbados. And so you have this history of African Americans contributing, of developing organizations, of fighting in the wars of this country, but not necessarily being treated as citizens of the country. 5,000 people of African descent fought in the Revolutionary War for the revolutionary cause. More than that fought for the British. Nearly 20,000 ran away to the British side to fight for the British, because the British, before the Americans, called for people of African descent to leave the plantation and come fight for them, and they would free them immediately if they did so. So many Africans ran to the British because they offered freedom before the Americans. And it was only after General Washington saw that the British were receiving all of these Africans and disrupting the slave system, in the South, but particularly in the northern colonies, that he then allowed free Blacks to fight for the cause of freedom. And also some enslaved Blacks went and fought in the war as well for the side of freedom, up to 5,000. And so that contribution is there from the very beginning. Africans have been in this country a long time. We know that the first ones arrived, they say, in 1619 for the British, but they were here much earlier with the Spanish. And they were recognized for their valor, and the double consciousness was always there, is that, thank you very much, now go back to the position that you held before the war for freedom against the British, which was a second-class position at best. After the war, many of the northern colonies rightfully abolished slavery. Massachusetts, which was the first to enslave, was also the first to abolish slavery after the war in 1783. They put it into their constitution that all men are born free and equal, and didn't distinguish between human beings based upon their color. Over the next few years, there was legislation to abolish slavery throughout the North. Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, and New Jersey followed much later. But this also led to this budding contradiction between the northern and the southern colonies, because the southern colonies were not about to give up such a lucrative enterprise, because too much wealth was being made by too many powerful men in the South. And they refused to abolish slavery, even though they had fought for their own freedom. They were willing to hold other people in abject unfreedom, right? Because they could benefit off their sweat and labor. And that's an immoral proposition, but it's the basis of the system of slavery that persisted in this society, and also the apartheid that has followed slavery to the present in this society comes from that same immoral proposition, the inability for a person to assume, the responsibility to be consistent between what they claim, what they say they stand for, and what they actually do. So this conflict now between the North and the South is going to exacerbate over time. The North and the South start to trade colonies back, trade states back and forth. One state will be admitted as a free state, and then the next state needs to be admitted as a slave state. And this led to what they called the Missouri Compromise, where um, the Missouri is supposed to be now the northern boundary of slavery, and no more free states are to slave states are to exist above the 3630 parallel. But this is shortly broken by in the 1850s with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But by 1830 now, you have the migrations of slaves into the lower South. You have huge numbers that are flowing in to grow cotton in the South. You have tremendous disruption of Black families. You have resistance, slave rebellions and resistance throughout the South and in the North. And you had at the same time a tremendous investment in slavery on the part of those that were invested in it, both in the South and in the North. So by 1830, there were 2 million slaves in the United States worth $1 billion. The entire annual federal revenue for the country was only 25 million, but the slaves' value was assessed at 2 billion. So you see how slavery has now been superimposed over whatever this country thinks it's doing or intends to do, just at an economic level, not to mention the strife that has now been introduced between the North and the South, because the South digs in deeper to hanging on to the slavery, where the North is rightfully trying to be consistent with the values of the Constitution and the American Revolution, and to free human beings that they're holding in the same type of bondage that they fought for. Cotton is growing, it's spreading. The conditions, the harsh conditions spread along with the crop. The rebellion follows the harsh conditions. So the contradiction is not just at a political level between the states, at an ideological level between those who really understand that you cannot be both a slave and a free country. You can be one or the other, but you can't be both. But the contradiction is also really harsh between African people who realize that their opportunity for freedom has just passed with the Revolutionary War, and these people in the South do not intend to free them, right? And they're going to have to fight for their freedom. And so resistance is very, proliferates with the spread of slavery that increases tremendously between 1820 and 1860. Again, you're talking about by 1860, the United States now is the fastest growing, has the fastest growing economy in the world in 1860. And cotton, right, is being produced at the crack of 2 billion pounds, right, that year. That was the production rate of cotton that year. And it was the dominant US export, almost 60% of all US exports that year. And it was a third of our exports in 1820 and over half of our exports in 1840. And so this is that tremendous value that has been generated by the slaves, the enslaved people, who are essential to the efficient, lucrative production of cotton. When I say that, I mean that if you look at the quantity of cotton that is being produced in 1860 compared to 1790, right? It actually increased by about 500%. I was telling you, from that 1.4 to 2 billion. But if you look at the price of cotton, you don't see this, even though the demand is increasing worldwide and the production, right, has accelerated. They're managed to still produce it at a similar price. The price only increases 15% over that time from 1790 to 1860, whereas the production has increased by 500%. We would expect, right, that there to be increases in price, but there's not, even though the demand has accelerated the way that it has. The price is able to stay low. Why? Because of the harshness of the system that was producing the cotton. The system forced Africans to work at an accelerated rate and controlled them in a manner that they continued to produce this cotton at in a profitable manner. And so some of the population statistics are here, and you see that the population is really accelerating and growing over time, but the percentage of slaves stays high in the population. 500,000 here of only 3.5 million people, 2 million here of just 13 million, you know, and almost 1 million here of just 5 million. And so the percentage of Africans based upon